Hello, and welcome to this training covering the basics of sexual orientation. My name is Francisco Ramirez, and I'm one of the co-founders of OKSO, and I'm so glad that you're joining us today for this topic that's really near and dear to my heart, sexual orientation. Okay, so often when we talk about the LGBTQ community, we a lot of times sort of lump all of those letters together. And today we want to take a little time to separate them out. So to begin, I want to first say that included in LGBTQ are at least two basic concepts: sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. It can be a lot to talk about everything all together, so we're going to talk about each one separately. And right now in this training here today, we're going to be focused on sexual orientation. We have another training that's focused on gender identity and expression, which we highly encourage you to watch if you haven't already. Okay, so now that we're clear about those basics, then what exactly are we then going to cover in this training here today? So we're going to spend some time talking about the history of sexual orientation, where we see it showing up in nature and history. We'll cover the basics of what it means as an identity and the terminology that's really important to know. We'll also talk specifically about young people and sexual orientation, as well as the challenges that young people face. And then finally, of course, we'll talk about some best practices when you're working with LGBT youth. Okay, so let's dive right in and talk about sexual orientation in nature and in history. If you think back to some nature documentaries that you might have watched as a kid, there probably wasn't a lot of conversation about same-sex animal relationships. But just because they weren't covered in National Geographic doesn't mean that they weren't there. Animal biologists, I find this very interesting, that animal biologists have confirmed over and over that same-sex pairings are actually quite common in the animal kingdom. And in fact, the more social that a species is, meaning the closer that they are to humans on the tree of life, the more likely they are to have same-sex behavior. So all in all, over 1,000 species do this that we know of. And if we look back at the field notes of early biologists, observations of same-sex behavior have actually been observed for over 2,000 years. Okay, so I brought some examples here for you today to show. First, did you know that rams actually prefer engaging in same-sex activity? And bonobos and chimpanzees, who are our closest relatives, both show bisexual behavior. Albatrosses will find a same-sex partner and stay with them for life. And warthogs also form long-term same-sex bonds. As for these black swans that we think about a lot, about 1/4 of black swan pairings are actually both males. And yes, you can see on the slide, we've got lions up in here too. Lions will pair bond with a same-sex lion for a number of days hanging out together. I know, who knew? Well, now we all do. And I think many folks, as you look at this last picture here, many folks have heard of penguin same-sex pairs. They're probably one of the more well-known examples. Okay, so we see this kind of activity all across the world among many different types of animal species. That's reality. But what about the history of pairings amongst humans? Well, I often hear from folks that same gender orientation or activities in humans is something new, that it's recently appeared. But I'm here to share that we have always been here. This image here is a tomb from ancient Egypt where two men are buried together. And throughout that tomb, there are images of the couple actually embracing each other. This image here depicts Emperor Ai of Han of China in about 2 BCE. Historians generally agree that emperors frequently took male lovers, and Emperor Ai had one named Dongxian. There's a famous story that I love, and it's shown here in this image. And the story goes that one day the emperor woke to find Dongxian asleep, resting his head on the emperor's sleeve. But the emperor didn't want to wake him up. And so Emperor Ai actually cut off the sleeve of his robe so that he wouldn't wake Dongxian. Allegedly, this started a fashion trend, and there's actually a phrase in Chinese that goes, the passion of the cut sleeve, which is actually a euphemism to describe intimacy between two men. Now, a little closer to our own time today, we see tons of examples of same-gender relationships between people who often were not allowed to be visible, but absolutely still existed. So from this, we can see that same-sex or same-gender attraction, orientation, activity, etc., is not something new or something trendy or something that people are somehow doing for attention, but instead is an identity that has always been a part of the human experience. Sexual orientation is just one part of what we call the paradigm of sexuality. And often we hear the term sexual orientation, and that's what I've been using here today. And what we mean by that is how someone identifies for themselves, the label they use, the way that they define their own identity. But that's not the only thing that we need to be aware of. We also have someone's sex characteristics, which you might also see referred to as sex assigned at birth, or even sometimes biological sex, I'll say in quotes. And we talk a lot more about this in our gender identity training, but often this plays a role in someone's overall conception of their sexuality. Their gender identity and expression, as you can see here, also play a role, since we usually talk about sexual orientation in a way that references both who we're attracted to, but also who we are. Next, we have sexual attraction. So outside of how someone identifies, this is who they're attracted to. And this can be different from sexual orientation. It might be broader, or it might actually be narrower. And we also have who folks are in relationships with. And again, this might be different from who they're attracted to or how they identify. For example, if we see someone who identifies as a woman in a relationship with someone who identifies as a man, we might assume that her sexual orientation is straight. But she may also identify as bisexual or pansexual or something else. And don't worry, by the way, we'll talk more about those terms in a moment. Okay, lastly here, we have sexual behavior. And you probably already know where I'm going with this. But again, what people do or have done in this case is an entirely separate part of identity. And on OK So, I can say that we frequently hear from young people who've been told that they, quote, aren't really gay because they haven't been sexually active yet. But what we've done and who we've done it with is not what determines our actual identities, how we name ourselves, how we identify. All right, so why am I covering this in so much detail? Well, it's because we frequently lump all of these things together when they should actually be separate. So, for instance, as I mentioned above just a moment ago, let's imagine that there are three pieces of information. You can see them here: attraction, who someone dates, and the physical activities that they're engaged in. Often, what our brains will do is what we've been trained really to do by the world is to find out one of these pieces of information and then assume all of the other ones, right? But in fact, what we realize when we look at the paradigm of sexuality, the totality of it all, is that anyone, but especially young people, can be forming their identities. that it might be a process, a journey, an exploration. And so knowing one piece of information tells us absolutely nothing about any of those other circles. So if a young man tells us, for example, that he has a girlfriend, that he does not, that he is dating a woman, for example, that does not mean that we know that he identifies as straight, or that he's only attracted to women, or that he's only dating women. Unless we ask, we are making assumptions. Okay. So we've already defined some basic concepts when we're talking about sexual orientation and identity. And so let's dig a bit deeper on what some of the letters in LGBTQIA mean.